Our group has been interested in why it is that so many people get cardiovascular disease the older they get. As a matter of fact, people over the age of 65 continue to have an increase in prevalence in cardiovascular disease the older they get. And this is in contradistinction to the fact that the second highest single killer of older people, which is cancer, goes down as you go up with age. So we've been studying why that is, and we found that there are a number of changes that happen with aging in the cardiovascular system independently of whatever we might do. So it's not all our fault. However, there's a lot of things that we can do to make it better. So among the things that we found include the fact that there are changes in the endothelial cells, which is the inner lining of our arteries that help us to process the signals that go through in our blood vessels from the many molecules that travel from the different parts of our body. In addition to that, the connective tissue that's formed around the arteries and within the muscle increases, so that makes the heart and the arteries stiffer. What that means is that the heart has to work harder to pump blood against the greater resistance. So all these things make it so that the older cardiovascular system has to work harder against greater resistance, and that means that it's a greater tax even at baseline. So many of us have also wondered why it is that older people are just more vulnerable. So if you take somebody over the age of 65 and you take somebody who's under the age of 65, if they both come to the emergency room at the same time, if they both had chest pain for the same duration, and it turns out that they have the same blockage in the same coronary artery, and it turns out that they have the same reserve lung function, they have the same reserve kidney function, they have the same reserve liver function, they have the same reserve brain function, the person that's over the age of 65 compared to the person who's under 65, if they both get revascularized, that is, if that blockage in that coronary artery gets opened within the same amount of time, there's a 5-fold higher mortality in the person who's over 65 compared to the person under 65. So why is that? If you revascularize at the same time and everything else is the same, why is the mortality still so high? It's not because of the supply of blood flow, because you've reestablished it, and yet they're still at greater risk. So the reason for that is because there are other changes that happen within the heart and within the rest of the body that predispose us to sustain greater damage. So what we've found is that what happens is that the cells within the heart have already experienced previous episodes of ischemia or hypoxemia or lack of oxygen, if you will. Those cells then are predisposed to undergo cell death. In addition to that, those proteins that fight against cell death, that is, that preserve our cells in the time of stress, there are some that are what we call pro-apoptotic, some that we call anti-apoptotic proteins. It's the balance of these two that then help to control which cells are going to live or die. And what happens is when we get older, there's more of the pro-apoptotic proteins, so that our cells are kind of ready. They've kind of been set to go because they had prior experiences with deprivation of nutrients or oxygen. In addition to that, the window, in other words, the time that you have to reestablish flow to the heart muscle from the time that you've occluded the artery to the time that you can still establish effective flow, that window is narrowed when we get older, so that in addition to the fact that people over 65 usually don't want to go to the doctor because they don't feel good, and the only time they want to go to the doctor is when they feel better. Like my mother always used to say, you know, I don't feel good today, I'm not going to go see the doctor. I want to wait until I'm better. Then I'll go see the doctor, because I don't want to tell the doctor I don't feel well. This is the way most patients, older patients are. They don't want to tell you they don't feel well. Or they think, well, you know, I'm just old. Anyway, so to make the long story short, that's part of it too, is that the cells have been preconditioned and pre-programmed to undergo cell death sooner and more readily than cells from a younger heart. And then we also wondered, why is it that older hearts are more prone to develop irregular heart rhythms? Why are older hearts prone to develop more heart failure? So we've been looking at this, and we've been looking at it in different ways, and I think that what we can say is there's actually quite good news, but it depends on each one of us. So for example, what we know is that the intracellular calcium handling changes with age, so that the duration of ionized calcium that happens within each cell when we depolarize the cell during a contraction of the muscle is prolonged. So what we need to do, we can either do it pharmacologically, for example, with a calcium antagonist, which we demonstrated a number of years ago, or through exercise conditioning. And exercise conditioning is the most effective way to be able to turn around some of these age changes that I just mentioned. For example, the heart can relax at a faster rate. It can utilize energy more effectively. It can replete ATP molecules more readily, and it can handle ionized calcium transients quicker so that the heart can relax faster, because it takes more oxygen and more ATP, or more energy, for the heart to relax than it does to contract. This is another observation that our group made a number of years ago. It used to be thought that it took more energy for the muscle to contract, but it turns out it takes more energy to relax. So other things, what are some other things that we could do? Well, there are other things that could help the heart, and it includes certain amino acids that one might ingest that can help the heart. It can help the arteries to relax better, because it'll help us to synthesize more nitric oxide synthase, which will help us to relax the arteries. In addition to that, there are certain genes that are programmed, as I mentioned earlier, for the heart to not be able to respond so well to stress. So we've been studying this for a number of years, and what we've found is that those genes that are responsible for the acute turning on of the entire synthetic machinery within the cell, these are called immediate early genes. They include genes like CFOS and CJUN, for example. These genes do not get upregulated or turned on, if you will, as well in an older heart compared to a younger heart. So what happens is, if there's an acute stress, the older heart doesn't get that signal to make more protein to get ready to respond to stress, and that's part of the reason why the old heart doesn't quite respond. So we've been looking at why this is. So we've been looking at why it is that these immediate early genes don't get induced, and it turns out that those proteins that regulate these genes to be induced are also altered with age. And what we were able to find is there is one protein that binds to the what we call the promoter region, which is that part of the gene that helps to get the gene activated. One of the proteins we found was slightly in excess in the older heart compared to the younger heart, and we wanted to see whether this might be part of the reason, because all the other proteins that help to turn on this immediate early gene were down, which is not surprising, but this one was up. So to make the long story short, we were able to find that this one protein is a very important protein. It's called serum response factor, and it is responsible for the induction of these immediate early genes, firstly. Secondly, it's very important in heart muscle. Thirdly, it's very important in cell death and programmed cell death. Fourthly, it's very important in differentiation and proliferation of cells. So when there's a slight imbalance in the regulation of this protein, it turns out some of these other proteins are also altered. So in summary, I think this is a very exciting area. We've been so fortunate to be able to observe a number of changes that happen with aging, and we've been able to find ways to be able to help to alter the age changes and be able to reverse changes in aging and or retard and or prevent.